What's up, everybody? It's Izzy, and in today's short video, what I want to talk about is how to regulate your rest days with biometrics. You will need a fitness tracking device to follow the information in this video. I personally have the Oura Ring, but something like a Fitbit or a Whoop could work as well. So the first thing that I look at is my sleep quality. Was it harder for me to fall asleep than usual? And especially, did I wake up in the middle of the night more often than usual? Disrupted sleep is a very strong indicator that you are experiencing a great deal of systemic or central fatigue more than usual. The other two variables that I look at from my fitness tracker are going to be heart rate variability and my actual resting heart rate itself. So heart rate variability will go up and down depending on your readiness. Keep in mind that this is specific to the individual. So a low heart rate variability for me is not a low heart rate variability for you, and the same goes for a high one. Now, that said, personally, when mine is low, it drops into the mid to high teens, and when it's solid, it's in the mid 20s. As you can see from some of the images on the screen here, typically when it's time for a training day, my heart rate variability will be at minimum in the low 20s, but I prefer to see it in the mid 20s. I know that when it's starting to get into the low 20s, I may need an extra rest day soon. And then eventually we'll get to something like what happened to me today, where my heart rate variability on a training day is still in the high teens. Normally, I would take a rest day on a day like this. Today, I'm not going to do that, because I only have 3 training days left to use both of my arms, and then I'm getting surgery anyway, and I'll probably take several days off after surgery regardless. So I'm going to try to force my way through it, even though today may not be the best of sessions. The last thing I look at is actual resting heart rate itself, and that one's pretty solid as an indicator, but it's really only going to change a few beats. So you can see when I'm well rested, well recovered, sometimes it's in the low 50s, and when I'm a little bit more stressed, that can be towards the high 50s or even the low 60s. Now, there are a couple things to keep in mind here as far as confounding variables. Your sleep quality can absolutely be confounded. The data can be confounded by high stress. If there's something big going on in your life that you are worried about, something financial, something with a relationship, that can cause you to sleep very poorly, and you might confuse that for training stress. Now, here's the thing. It somewhat doesn't matter because your stress bucket takes psychological and emotional and physical stress all into the same bucket. So it's going to impact your training either way. And if you are going through a lot of outside stress, sometimes it's wise to take that day off if your other indicators are also saying that you should. Heart rate variability can be affected by having a huge meal right before you go to bed. That will often result in much lower heart rate variability than you would think, even though you're recovering just fine. It's just that you were digesting a huge meal while you were sleeping, and that kept your heart rate from getting higher and higher. The last thing is that your resting heart rate is solid, but you're never going to see huge swings in it. So you can't use that by itself. The last thing that I want to say about this is that in order for this to have a ton of viability as a strategy, you have to be the person that's very consistent with most of your variables to begin with. Otherwise, this data will be all over the place, and it won't necessarily tell you that much. I also would not like to see beginners or early intermediates trying to adapt to this strategy, because you're just going to find excuses and ways out of training. And nothing about what you're doing is super consistent yet anyway, so the data is not telling you much. This is something strictly for advanced athletes to consider, and even if they're getting a poor reading, I've had good workouts when I've had poor readings. I've also had a lot of bad workouts with poor readings, more than good. So I use this information more often than not to actually modify my split. If I'm regularly running into a situation where I'm having a scheduled training day and my biometrics are terrible for that day, it's usually an indicator to me that my split has too much training in it, either in terms of volume or in terms of frequency, and I'll modify my split rather than just doing a one-off extra rest day. So just as a brief summary, the top 3 biometrics that I would suggest that you look at to help you regulate your rest days, or maybe to provide insight into a split change, is 1, sleep quality. Are you having disrupted sleep? Are you having a difficult time falling asleep compared to usual? It has to be compared to your normal baseline. If you just have trouble falling asleep all the time, it doesn't necessarily tell you much. 2, heart rate variability. Now, this has several confounding variables, but it's a very strong indicator. If your heart rate variability is significantly lower than usual, that is an indicator that you are experiencing a good deal of systemic or central fatigue, and it may be wise to dissipate some of that before going in and having a poor training session. Last, corroborate this data with your resting heart rate. Very, very typically, if you're more stressed than normal, your resting heart rate is going to be elevated compared to baseline. And again, if you're a beginner or an intermediate, track this stuff for your own interest, but don't give it too much weight. Train when you're supposed to train.